All right. I think everybody can see that all right. Okay, now we're starting on Buddhism, and as I mentioned earlier, we will do this in 4 parts, and that's just to cut down on the size of each video for downloading and everything. But we've already gone through Hinduism, and Buddhism comes out of a Hindu background. So we'll get moving on that. All right. Well, Buddhism is a very interesting religion and quite different, like Hinduism, very different from the monotheistic religions. Even though it doesn't have all the gods and goddesses that the Hinduism has, it's still quite different from the monotheistic religions. Here's just some pictures. One of the great things about Buddhists, they people who build temples for the monks, they have built some magnificent things over the centuries. And these are just a couple examples. Angkor Wat over here on Cambodia is an ancient city with huge amount of buildings in its heyday. Now it's not used, but it's one of the big wonders of the world that people go to see. I've yet to get out there to see it, but it's on my wife and my bucket list. But if you want to see something, I gave you a link to the top 20 beautiful Buddhist temples around the world. It's quite interesting. Here's some examples of things that that are around. And and give you a link to some introductory video on Buddhism itself, much of which we'll cover in this video, in this presentation, I should say. Location of Buddhism, you see a circle up here where Seoul kind of covers where Buddhism is in Southeast Asia on up into China, Mongolia, and that area. This is where it's primarily at. And so it really overall has a limited influence globally, but you'll find plenty of practitioners of it in various parts of the West as well. But there's still a small percentage, like in the US, it's 1-2% best. But when you get over to like Southeast Asia, like Cambodia, it's about 95% Theravada Buddhists. We'll talk about the difference between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, as we get further on. But Theravada Buddhism is the original Buddhism, and we'll talk about the split later. All right. So Buddhism, about 360 million, 6% of the world population, makes it about the 5th largest world religion after Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and secular non-religious groups of people. That's actually a picture my son took or had taken of him and a Buddhist monk that he met in a internet cafe while he was in Cambodia. And he got to talk with him and find out some things about Buddhism. We're going to break this up into about 5 different parts. We're going to talk about the origin of Buddhism, history, main tenets, worldview, and bridges to Christianity. Here's an example of a great carving in a mountain, and incredible artwork goes along with Buddhism, and particular parts of Buddhism, really part of meditation is some art, as can be a part of it. So the origins of Buddhism began in the 7th century BC. Biblical history at this point, you'll be getting close to the end of the southern kingdom, which Jerusalem be taken in 586 BC. So 6th century, they'll make it, the century before that, 600s. But the time of Jeremiah would be this time period. And so Buddha is the title that signifies the enlightened one or the awakened one, also called Shakyamuni, the sage. So this was the title given to Siddhartha Gautama and when he was born in 563 BC. He would die in 583 BC. The biography of his life does not appear until several hundred years later. Long after he's dead is before we get his writings. And it's also about the time period the scriptures of Buddhism start appearing. It's a little quite different from biblical scripture. If you look at the New Testament and when after Jesus' death, when scripture started appearing was quite quick, within 50 years, a lot of the New Testament was already written. It was said that his life was the last of 500 reincarnations. So it took him that many reincarnations to get to the point where he would live a life in which he would get released from the cycle of reincarnation. So Siddhartha Gautama, his birth, he was born into a wealthy family. Father was a king Suddhodana, and when he was born, well, actually before he was born, there were some signs that were there before his birth and accompanied his birth. But his mother had a dream of a white elephant, indicating he would be a great emperor or holy man. Is this picture over here indicates this thing. Some of these pictures that you'll see about his life come from a website that deals with Theravada Buddhism, and it's a pictures of the story of his life. Interesting website if you want to find it. Astrologers told his father the same thing, that he was going to be someone great. I'm not sure they expected what they got. Mother gave birth, the uniqueness of it out of her side, and it says the world shook. And one tradition talks about Gautama, when he's born, he actually speaks. It says, "I am born for the salvation of the world. This is my last rebirth." And so you have these things recorded about his uniqueness of his birth. And as he was growing up, he was protected by his father, and his father, of course, already believed he was going to be a great king, so he groomed him to be king. But he's going to turn his life a different direction, of course. And so he got married at the age of 16, which was not unusual for the wealthy in that time period, to the princess Yashodhara. And but by age 29, he would be exposed to something that he hadn't really been exposed to. He was protected by his father for all these years, and but he didn't really get out and see the world around him, and so the story goes that he wanted to go out and see the world around where they lived, where the king and his palace were, and but his father knew what he would see out there, all the pain and suffering and things that he didn't see in the palace. But the story goes, father allowed him to take a chariot ride, but he sent people ahead and told him, make sure he doesn't see any of the poor and the suffering, hide them away so he doesn't run into them on his chariot ride around. You can see the picture up here indicating this. And the story goes, however, the gods assumed human form. And so in the process of his going around the chariot, he saw an old man near death, a man disfigured by disease, a funeral procession of a decomposing body, and a monk who had renounced the world. And so, despite his father's best intentions, he got exposed to a world of where there is suffering. And out of this, at age 30, he decides to forsake his status and wealth and seek the meaning of life, is how it goes. And so he would start looking at the religion of the monks, the Vedantic traditions were the direction he will go. We'll talk about that later. And so his first quest for enlightenment, he was under the mentoring of two Brahmins, and so they were hermits, Alara and Udaka, but he wasn't pleased with what they were telling him, because they were unable to tell him how to put an end to the cycle of rebirths. Now, this is important because the whole purpose of Theravada Buddhism for monks is to get out of the cycle of rebirths, but they couldn't tell him that, so he moved on to a second quest for enlightenment, and this was through asceticism, which he went through with 5 companions. But in the end, he felt like that this self-mortification and denying yourself did not lead to self-realization, but only to enfeebled body and mind. And so he felt like, that was never going to lead anybody to enlightenment. And that was the common means in Hinduism, is this asceticism and self-mortification. But he's going to propose a different way. So enlightenment was obtained when he devoted himself to a simple life of intense mental discipline. And here he is sitting under the Bodhi tree, which is where he's said obtained enlightenment. So after prolonged meditation of 7 years while sitting under the Bodhi tree, he received the answer to his quest. There's a middle path. And so it's not asceticism, nor is it, just one thing. It's the middle path. And he ends up receives his enlightenment. He becomes known as Buddha, or Tathagata, one who has gone, and that's gone to enlightenment. It's another title of honor for Buddha. So the Theravada Buddhism is another way they call it the middle path. But because he wants to tell other people about this middle path, he postpones his release, decides to share his way of enlightenment, and begins to preach. And you'll find later that other people that have received enlightenment can put it off and be teachers to teach people the way and of Buddhism before they die and get release. So he's going to postpone his release, and so he converts 5 followers and then his family as he starts out. One legend says he ascended into heaven after his death. Actually, what it appears is he actually died after eating spoiled pork given as an offering. That's people gave things to the monks as offerings, and food was part of it. The Buddhists say that words cannot truly describe the Prince Gautama's enlightenment. And there's a video included here for talking about the place where he received his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. All right, and the collection of his teachings and the split that's going to split from Theravada to what will be Mahayana Buddhism. There's a third major branch that we'll talk about as well. But after his death, his followers collected his teachings. They were called the Triptaka. I never can get that word fully out. Tripitaka, that's it, Tripitaka, meaning 3 baskets. And so they would get started. So but they wouldn't get out to the public till much later. Second Council in 380 BC, they were arguing over the greater role for the laity and less strict discipline, because Theravada Buddhism is a religion for the monks, for people who take on the religious duty to be a monk. And wasn't made for the common person and never was intended to be that way. But there were people among the monks that were saying, maybe we should make this more advantageous for just common folks. And so this was part of the debate. So it would lead to a split between Theravada and what's called Mahayana Buddhism in 200 BC. And we will talk about the difference between these. By the Fourth Council, which would be in the 1st century BC, the time of Jesus and the beginning of the church, in other words, this would be the first time sutras or scriptures were written down in the Pali language. So this would be the first actual canon of scripture in Buddhism, called the Pali Canon. And so you can see it's been a number of centuries since Buddha's death before this written form of the scriptures came together as a group. All right, well, these teachings and the split here, you've got the 3 baskets here, and the Tripitaka here, it means you got the Vinaya Pitaka, the monastic rules basket. So this group of scripture, they deal with the rules for a monastic life. And the Sutta Pitaka, words of the Buddha basket. So that one's records Buddha's words. And then Abhidhamma Pitaka, this is the higher teaching baskets for monks. And so this would be specialized teaching for the reserved for monks, which for the most part, all this would have only concerned the monks traditionally with Theravada Buddhism. Over the years, more scriptures are added. It isn't like they had this one canon and nothing was added later to it. All right. So as we think about Buddhism and its beginnings, this map just kind of shows its spread. Here you have the beginning of Shakyamuni, where he lived, and then it's spread out from here to this various areas. And you can see most of it's in Southeast Asia, China, into India, and Indonesia as well. And then up here north to Korea and so forth. But this map gives a little bit of telling you when Buddhism spread to these various areas. So the name Theravada Buddhism is it's from an expression meaning tradition of the elders. So it's the traditional first expression of Buddhism in that regard. And so when people talk about Buddhism, a lot of times they just talk about Buddhism, but there's a number of forms of Buddhism, but the traditional one would be Theravada Buddhism. Um, and so it retains emphasis with the religion centered on the monks. It's also called Hinayana, which means little raft, and this is in distinction from the split where the first of Mahayana Buddhism called the big raft, basically meaning only a few people can get on a little raft. Many more people under Mahayana Buddhism can fit and find enlightenment on a big raft, and that's the idea there. The height of Theravada Buddhism was 3rd century BC, and that would be its kind of heyday. But of course, there's going to be a split, so that's why it's after that it's not the height of Theravada Buddhism. It's now mainly in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Most of the other areas are Mahayana Buddhism, and but Theravada Buddhism, even to this very day, mainly is a religion for monks. All right, and so we're going to talk about that part of it in the next video. So I'm going to cut it off here, and we'll pick up on the next video.